Today we're going to talk about two different cases of a John Doe and a Jane Doe. It would take decades, but both of them would finally get their names back. The story of how and why they came to be discovered but unidentified for decades is in itself a tragedy. But these cases are also a perfect example of there always being a chance for cold cases being solved. First, let's talk about Thelma Gaston. Thelma Jeanette Molster was born on February 13, 1901 in Minnesota. She would marry Edson Joseph Gaston in Wisconsin in 1919 when she was 18 years old. The couple would move to California. Then Thelma would give birth to a son, Edson Bruce Gaston, in 1927. Thelma's son Edson would go on to graduate from UCLA with an MBA in 1951. He registered for military service and earned the rank of First Lieutenant of the 195th Fighter Squadron of the California National Guard. On January 4, 1957, tragedy would strike the Gaston family. Thelma's husband Edson would die suddenly of natural causes, thought to be a heart attack. He was a retired master plumber and had worked for the Sipfle Plumbing Company. According to newspaper reports, he had been digging a sewer line at a residence when he collapsed and died. He was 66 years old. Then, just 8.5 months later, tragedy would visit the Gaston family once again. On Wednesday, September 24, 1957, two 1,000-mile-an-hour U.S. jet fighters collided over the North Atlantic during a training mission. The plane took off from Van Nuys Airport, where it soon severed a telephone pole, bounced off a walnut tree, and then crashed into the backyard of a house, which caused the house and nearby guest house to burst into flames. Killed in the crash, along with the captain, was First Lieutenant Edson Bruce Gaston, age 30. In November of 1958, Lieutenant Gaston was posthumously awarded a Soldier's Medal. The medal was for the earlier heroic rescue of another pilot whose plane overturned on takeoff. Ironically, Lieutenant Gaston would later die in a similar accident. His mother would accept the medal for him at a ceremony at the Van Nuys Air National Guard base. So Thelma Gaston had suffered the sudden loss of her 44-year-old brother in 1940. Then in 1957, she lost both her husband and her only child within months of each other. As you can imagine, she was devastated at the loss of her family. Then in 1959, Thelma Gaston would be the one to make headlines. Thelma Gaston would apparently go missing. She was last seen at her home on 2423 Patricia Avenue in Los Angeles on March 20th, 1959, by neighbors. Detectives would enter her home and said that it was well stocked with food, but her mail had been accumulating. Her 1955 black Thunderbird, that used to belong to her late son, was missing from the garage, and officials from her bank said that no checks had been written during the week between when she was last seen and when she was reported missing. Detectives found no evidence of foul play at the home. They said she wouldn't have had a substantial amount of money on her, but she may have been carrying expensive jewelry. The former squadron commander of her deceased son would tell authorities that Thelma Gaston had phoned him several times in the 18 months since he had been killed, sounding very upset. Neighbors would agree and said that Thelma was struggling, still devastated at the loss of her husband and son. Soon after Thelma Gaston was reported missing, authorities would find her abandoned car with her driver's license and ID left inside, parked and locked behind one of the properties she owned at 1015 West 8th Street in Los Angeles. Gaston had apparently left her newly redecorated Fox Hills home so hastily that she left clothes on the clothesline, her Persian cat uncared for, and her back door was left open. Then, just a few days after being reported missing, police received an anonymous tip as to the whereabouts of Thelma Gaston. She was in jail under the alias name of Sylvia Stanley. She had been arrested on March 21st, the day after she was last seen, at a downtown department store and charged with shoplifting. She pled guilty the next day to the charge. There really wasn't much information to be found about Thelma for the next 20 years. Then in 1981, Thelma Gaston would once again make headlines. But this time it was for a different reason. The 80-year-old widow would go missing again and was last seen on June 28, 1981. She supposedly left a note at her Rancho Park home saying that she was going out to look for her cat. Police were alerted to her disappearance and would find other letters that were said to have been written by Gaston. In them, she complained that everyone was after her money. She said that she was leaving all of her holdings to charity. She also said that she had turned over her affairs to 39-year-old Larry Remsen. She ended it by saying, "I am changing my life. I'm going to have some fun in life, and nobody is going to stop me." Upon hearing about the disappearance and the note left behind, Thelma Gaston's attorney John Mittrick and business associate Harry Myers would say that the things said in the note do not fit the woman's character. She was described as a shrewd businesswoman who made a large amount of money buying tax-repossessed real estate. By 1981, some sources say that she was worth $20 million, which is the equivalent to a staggering $73 million today. Police would also mention another letter that was supposedly written by Gaston. It was dated June 27th, the day before she disappeared, and was addressed to Oxford Properties Limited, which was the prospective buyer of her Harbor Freeway property. In it, she directed that the check for the proceeds be sent to a bank in the Cayman Islands. The letter had the imprint of a notary stamp that had been reported stolen. They also acquired a copy of a document granting Thelma Gaston's power of attorney to Remsen. It also bore the imprint of the stolen notary stamp. There was another letter from Gaston Properties to a Prudential Savings and Loan in Century City, directing that $20,000 from the company be sent to a New York bank for transfer to an account in the Cayman Islands. The money was sent, but was then placed on hold, along with all of Gaston's other assets, while police continued to search for the missing widow. Police wanted to question Larry Remsen concerning Thelma Gaston's disappearance. When they asked him where she was by phone, he refused to answer and then quickly disappeared. They would trace him to an address in Newport Beach. He was not there, but they did recover furniture allegedly stolen from a West Los Angeles apartment where Remsen had lived prior. The DA's office in Santa Monica would obtain a felony arrest warrant for Larry Remsen for grand theft in regards to the furniture. Another thing of interest found at the Newport Beach location was Thelma Gaston's late model Mercedes that was found parked in the garage. It had not been reported stolen, so police did not take it. It did, however, just like its owner, soon disappear. Further investigation into Larry Remsen would reveal that he was a former employee of an Orange County burglar alarm company. He had also declared bankruptcy in February of 1980. Police compared Thelma Gaston's signature from her signature card at the bank to the letters that she supposedly left behind. They were found to not be a match. Also, the signature on the document granting Larry Remsen power of attorney on Gaston's holdings was said to be a forgery. Larry Remsen was now the prime suspect in the disappearance of Thelma Gaston. But Remsen was now missing too. Police would discover that since Thelma Gaston's disappearance, Larry Remsen had tried unsuccessfully to negotiate several land deals, as well as a $106,000 car supposedly on her behalf. Police would seek warrants charging Remsen with forgery and unlawful flight to avoid prosecution. Witnesses say that Larry Remsen had been sighted a few weeks earlier driving off in Gaston's Mercedes. Friends of both of the now missing people would admit that there appeared to be a romantic involvement between the couple. They had talked about marriage and of taking an around-the-world cruise. Thelma Gaston apparently liked Remsen very much. People who knew him would describe him as a salesman engaged in rather shady business practices. They went on to say that in the past he had even defrauded his grandparents of thousands of dollars. Thelma Gaston's $20 million estate would be placed under public conservatorship as authorities continued to sort everything out and tried to find not only her, but Larry Remsen. It was revealed that Gaston's estate was more than 100 parcels in Southern California. They also found a dozen passbook accounts of 6 figures each. Attorney John Mittrick would be named the trustee of the estate. He was a longtime advisor as well as a distant relative. He claimed that he had misplaced a will made out the year before, where Gaston appointed him as the trustee of the estate. The judge stayed the appointment for 2 weeks at the request of UCLA, who claimed to be an heir to a large portion of her fortune. The police now knew the type of reputation that Larry Remsen had, and that the letters and documents purported to be from Gaston had been forged by him. They had no choice but to come to a sobering assumption. They now believed the 80-year-old wealthy widow was dead. Now they not only had to find Thelma Gaston, they had to find Larry Remsen too. Luckily, the second part of that equation would happen soon. In early September of 1981, Larry Remsen was taken into custody in a car on a bridge over the Rio Grande. A check from INS revealed that Remsen was wanted in California on suspicion of forging documents giving him access to a $20 million estate. The LAPD would talk to Remsen on the phone that night to verify his identity. Remsen was told that they wanted to locate Gaston, and he claimed that he did not know where she was. He then agreed to be extradited back to California. He had apparently traveled 1,600 miles across Mexico in the last 2 months before attempting to re-enter the U.S., resulting in his arrest. He would be booked for investigation and grand theft and held in lieu of $260,000 bail. On October 15, 1981, a murder charge would be filed against Larry Remsen regarding Thelma Gaston. Other charges of 6 counts of forgery, 4 counts of grand theft, and attempted grand theft would also be filed. The deputy DA would say that they were told by Remsen's attorney that he found Gaston's body and threw it in the ocean, but the police seemed to discount this statement. In December of 1982, the murder trial against Larry Remsen would begin. The prosecution would claim that Thelma Gaston was killed a few days after she threatened to file a fraud complaint against Remsen. They said that she had loaned him money and she suspected that he had provided her with phony collateral. Larry Remsen would take the stand and testify that he discovered Thelma Gaston's body in her kitchen, weighted it down, and dumped it at sea. He then told people that she went on an extended vacation as he proceeded to sell $20,000 from her estate. After a 13-week trial, Judge Gordon Ringer, referring to him as an incompetent scoundrel, found Remsen guilty of second-degree murder as well as the other 11 forgery and theft charges. On May 24, 1983, he was sentenced to 21 years to life in prison with an additional 6 years for the forgery and grand theft charges. On November 28, 1981, people were out collecting firewood off Highway 74 in the Santa Rosa Mountains near Pinyon Crest when they saw human remains sticking out of a shallow grave. They called the police. Due to the advanced state of decomposition, the remains could not be identified. The remains showed signs of arthritis, and investigators believe that the Jane Doe may have suffered from epilepsy or an altered mental state. Then in 2022, the Riverside County coroner received funding through the Missing and Unidentified Human Remains Grant. This allowed investigators to revisit cold cases using modern forensic techniques. It is hoped that the funding would lead to identifying previously unknown victims. Because of the funding, the unidentified Jane Doe would be exhumed in 2024 so that a sample could be taken for DNA. The sample was then submitted to Othram, which is a forensic genealogy lab. After painstaking work using genetic genealogy, they found information that pointed to the Gaston family. They would also utilize dental records to confirm their findings. After 45 years, the Pinyon Crest Jane Doe was finally revealed to be Thelma Jeanette Gaston. The fact that Thelma Gaston was murdered sadly didn't really come as a surprise. After all, Larry Remsen had been convicted of her murder 43 years earlier. Speaking of Larry Remsen, he is still alive and rotting in a jail cell, as he should be. He continues to serve his life sentence at the California Institute for Men in Chino. He is 83 years old and has exhausted all of his appeals. The identification of Thelma Gaston's remains contradicts the story that Remsen has always given. The remains, when they were located in 1981, were buried and also determined to be that of a murder victim. However, Larry Remsen's sworn testimony at his trial was that he found Gaston deceased on her kitchen floor and then threw her body in the sea. Now having evidence to the contrary of those lies will hopefully ensure that his parole will once again be denied at his next scheduled parole hearing in July of 2028. As far as my thoughts, this case is so maddening. Thelma Gaston suffers two devastating losses of her husband and only child just months apart. She picks herself up and works the next 20 plus years and proceeds to amass a fortune on her own through her hard work and shrewd business knowledge. Then comes the snake. I noticed that when the Pinyon Crest Jane Doe was first found back in 1981, the autopsy findings said they thought that she perhaps had epilepsy or even dementia. So I'm assuming something was visible on her brain that led them to that conclusion. There was no mention of epilepsy in her past, so possibly it was dementia. If Thelma Gaston did have dementia, that could leave her at a diminished mental state, depending on what stage it was, and just made the fact that slimy conman Larry Remsen could weasel his way into her life more understandable and even more infuriating. Like I said, I'm glad that he is rotting behind bars and that police were able to figure out quickly the role that he played in her disappearance. It would take 45 years, but I'm so glad that Thelma Gaston's remains were identified. I'm unsure if they were relocated near her husband and son's remains, but at least the remaining family can have the peace of now knowing where she is. In so many cases, the families don't get justice, but at least in this case, the killer was soon found and has spent more than 40 years locked in a cell, and Thelma Gaston was eventually returned to her family. At least she got some kind of justice in that regard. The second case we're going to talk about concerns a John Doe whose death was discovered in a gruesome way. Like with Thelma Gaston, it would take decades, but recently some answers would be revealed, and those answers would surprise everyone. This case is very unusual. I just recently heard about it, and as soon as I did, I knew that I wanted to cover it. It started on October 15, 1975, in Arizona. A young worker from the Arizona Sonora Desert Museum emptied the trash from the property into the back of his truck and threw some bricks on top of the load of trash to keep the wind from blowing it away. He then drove to the landfill near Ryan Field, about 12 miles west of Tucson, Arizona. As he was dumping the bags at the landfill, one plastic bag caught his eye. The bag had the name of the store Foodland on it, but it didn't contain food. It contained a severed human hand. The man then called museum officials to tell them of his find and hurried back to the museum in a panic. The museum would then call the Pima County Sheriff's Department. The police arrived at the museum and then accompanied the garbage collector back to the dump. They were hoping that he could point out where the bag was that contained the human hand. Unfortunately, by the time they got there, a sanitation employee had covered that trash area with even more trash with his bulldozer. The authorities would spend the next 4 hours sifting through the garbage trying to locate the human remains. It was starting to get dark, so they brought in a truck with portable floodlights to help light the way. At about 7:55 p.m. that night, they found the hand. They continued to search at the dump for 8 more hours the following day and located more human remains. A team of 7 detectives was now helping in the search. They checked garbage bags in the vicinity of the museum as well as nearby campgrounds. They also checked the Saguaro National Monument and Old Tucson, but no remains were found there. However, numerous body parts were recovered during the 2-day search, including a left foot, parts of a left and right arm, and thigh, as well as body tissue. The man's head was not found. Nearly all of the skin on the man's palm and fingerprints had been trimmed away. It was thought from the start that the reason for the dismemberment was to keep the victim from being identified. Medical examiner Dr. Hirsch would be able to give authorities some details about the man. He estimated that he was a middle-aged white man with a heavy build and had probably worn a wedding ring on his left hand. He said that the man had been dismembered using a saw and a sharp knife, and the person who did was not likely a professional due to how jagged the cuts were. Going by when the trash was taken out at the museum, they were able to narrow down when the remains were put there. It was sometime between October 12th and early in the day October 15th. Authorities were not able to say exactly when the man died, but Dr. Hirsch did say that he was likely dead for 2 to 7 days. The Foodland bag some of the remains were found in was really the only clue. There were stores with that name in Iowa, Michigan, and Texas, among others. Interestingly, Teamster leader Jimmy Hoffa had disappeared just 2.5 months before the remains were discovered. There was reportedly a Foodland store in Detroit that was only 7 or 8 miles from the last place that Hoffa was seen. The police requested a copy of Hoffa's fingerprints to see if they could be a match. They were quickly ruled out, and the hands discovered did not belong to Jimmy Hoffa. In an article in the Arizona Daily Star dated just 8 days after the remains were discovered, it said that 2 human skulls had been found recently as well, but they described them as unrelated incidents as they were found 60 miles apart. A female skull was found near the State Highway 38 exit of Interstate 10 southeast of Tucson. They said the skull was of a middle-aged woman and she had a crack on the back of the skull, indicating that she may have been struck. Also found was the skull of a man thought to have been dead for a year, 35 miles southwest of Tucson. He had a bullet hole in the back of his head. Years and then decades would go by with no clues as to the identity. The remains were kept in storage. In 2025, not forgetting about the case, the Pima County Sheriff's Department would partner with a company that specialized in forensic genealogy. Through the advanced work, they were able to locate a relative of the John Doe. When interviewed, this person had an interesting story for the authorities. She told detectives that she had a grandfather who mysteriously vanished in the 1970s. It is unclear why, but the family had never reported him missing. Recent news reports say that the family may have been misled by someone. He had in the past done missionary work in Mexico, so perhaps the family initially thought that he was there. With the granddaughter giving the authorities the final piece of the puzzle, and the genetic connection between them was soon verified. Now, after more than 50 years, the John Doe was identified as 73-year-old William Reginald Sipfle. But just because he now had a name, that doesn't mean that the authorities were done with this case. This case would now start to take a turn that shocked everyone. Police soon learned that William Sipfle had lived at 7460 North La Canada Drive in Tucson. They also learned that since his disappearance, now for 50 years, that his stepdaughter had continued to live in the home. She was named Carol Ann Beal and was now 79 years old. The police would interview her. They also conducted a search of the property. The results of the search were shocking. They found more human remains. They were sent off for testing, and the results aren't back yet, but they're thought to be more remains of William Sipfle. It wouldn't take long for authorities to figure this macabre story out. In late May of 2026, Carol Ann Beal was taken into custody. She was charged with the first-degree murder of her stepfather and booked into the Pima County Jail with the bond of $500,000 cash. More incriminating evidence pointing towards Carol Beal would be revealed. She had worked as a night custodian at the Arizona Sonora Desert Museum at the time that the remains were found. Remember, that's where the trash that the remains were found in originated from. A little more has been revealed about William Sipfle. He married Catherine Byrne in 1952 near Springfield, Illinois. Carol Beal would have been a young child then. The family relocated to Hermiston, Oregon, where Sipfle worked as a city engineer. I found an article from 1969 in a Hermiston newspaper where Sipfle announced his retirement. It said that he earned a civil engineering degree from the University of Illinois in 1925. He worked mostly in the western states, living in California for 8 years. Before moving to Hermiston, he'd lived in Enterprise, Oregon, where he owned a ranch on the Imnaha River. After retiring in 1969, he moved with his wife to Tucson. Not much has been said about Sipfle's wife, Carol's mother, so I did a little digging. I was able to find a death announcement for her. It said that Catherine Sipfle died at the age of 64 on November 9, 1973 in Tucson. It also said that she was survived by a daughter named Mrs. Carol Ann Honora of Portland, Oregon. If that information is correct, it meant that just 2 years before he disappeared, Carol wasn't living in William's home in Tucson. Perhaps after her mother died, she moved into William Sipfle's home on the premise of helping him. Court records tell us that William Sipfle had made out a will that at least some family members claim that they were unaware of. His estate was said to be worth over $200,000. In the will, it states that he wanted the proceeds divided as such: 40% to his son Reginald, 30% to the Grace Chapel Church in Tucson, 10% to his brother Carl, 10% to his sister Clara, and 10% as well as his house to his stepdaughter Carol, who is now accused of murdering him. William's son Reginald would petition to have William Sipfle declared legally dead in 2005, 30 years after his disappearance. Stepdaughter Carol Beal was named the personal representative of the estate and the residence, largely because she was the only one who lived locally. Carol Beal has pleaded not guilty to the charges. As far as the motive, police believe that it could point to William Sipfle's pension and Social Security checks. If he was missing but not declared officially dead until 30 years later, then there's a chance that she could have been cashing his pension and Social Security checks for all that time. Reports say that she could have fraudulently cashed up to $600,000 worth of checks meant for her stepfather. The circumstances surrounding William Sipfle's death and even exactly when he died are still uncertain. There is a newspaper article from April 30th, 1975, which is 5.5 months before his remains were found, concerning a house fire at his residence. It said that $6,000 worth of damage was done to his home, which is the equivalent of around $37,000 today, that was limited to the kitchen. A neighbor called the fire department around 8 p.m. to report the fire. No one was home, and firefighters found a pan left on the stove with the burner still on that ignited a cupboard and bookshelves located above the stove. The Sipfle family was shocked and saddened to learn of their loved one's murder. They were also grateful to have one part of the mystery of this disappearance solved. They released a statement that read, "The Sipfle family is relieved to have closure regarding the whereabouts of our grandfather, William Reginald Sipfle, with the positive identification of our grandfather's remains. With this new information about our grandfather, we are processing the circumstances around his death and reliving painful memories of his disappearance and of our father's efforts to locate his father." As far as my thoughts on this case, it just sickens me. That poor man. He has a stepdaughter that he thinks enough of to include in his will and even bequeaths his house to her, and look at how she acts. She apparently murders him, hacks his body into pieces, and scatters them all over to hide the crime? Spreading part of your stepfather's dismembered remains where you work isn't exactly the smartest move either. The DNA results haven't come back yet, but it looks like she left some of his remains at home for the past 50 years. Since it isn't certain when William Sipfle was killed, I can't help but wonder about that house fire. We don't know a lot of the facts, and perhaps they will come out if the case goes to trial. But I'm curious, when was the last time William Sipfle was seen in 1975? If it was just before his house fire, then that might give us a clue to his murder. The article says that no one was home and a burner on the stove was left on. That could be true and a purely innocent oversight that resulted in a kitchen fire. But what if it were staged? It's very possible that at the time of the fire that Carol Beale was living with her stepfather. Could she have murdered him then and put his body somewhere in the house other than the kitchen? She then put the pan on the stove and turned the burner on and fled in hopes of a fire starting that would burn the house down and get rid of any evidence of a murder. Plus, if she had a house insurance policy, she could have gotten a substantial payday if the house burned down. This is just a possible theory, and I realize that this theory would go against the medical examiner's estimation in 1975 of the body being dead for only 2 to 7 days. But they also believe that the body was from a man in his 40s or 50s who turned out to actually be 73, and that he had a heavy frame, which, by the few pictures we've seen of William anyway, was also false. But I do realize that this autopsy was conducted 50 years ago, and there have been countless advancements in that field since. We've yet to see what Carol Beale's defense is. If she continues to claim that she's not guilty, perhaps some sort of insanity defense, given her bizarre actions in dismembering her stepfather's body, or even that she found him dead and instead of alerting the proper authorities, hid his remains. Both just pure speculation on my part. But I believe at the center of this heartless case is just pure greed. Perhaps it was just easier to live off of his money that came regularly every month than to support herself. But as far as the house, William Sipfle had already left her his house in the will, and was at the advanced age of 73. So was it that she just couldn't wait for him to die naturally and ended his life on her own time frame? This case is just sickening. But the positive part of this case is that even though it took 50 years, the alleged murderer is still alive. So many of these cases that are solved decades later that we often hear about, the person thought to have committed the murder is usually dead. But Carol Beale has already been arrested and charged with murder, and now the whole world knows the kind of person that she really is. If she is convicted, hopefully she can spend the rest of her days locked in a cell. I hope for the surviving family's sake that more can be learned and they can have more answers as to what caused this horrible crime. These two cases have a lot of similarities. The victims were both unidentified for decades until the use of genetic genealogy. It appears that they were both betrayed and murdered by someone that they trusted. The killer and accused killer are both still alive. One has been punished for decades, and the other will hopefully be able to serve her punishment if convicted before she leaves this earth. It's always nice when families that have been in limbo for decades can finally get some answers. Genetic genealogy and all the hard work that goes behind it is a big reason why, in these cases, the identities have been revealed. That concludes my podcast on Thelma Gaston and William Sipfle. If you enjoyed it, please leave me a rating or review where you listen to your podcasts. You can find me on Spotify, Amazon Music, Apple Podcasts, iHeartRadio, YouTube, and YouTube Music under Lost and Found Podcast. You can view all of my original articles, as well as links to my most recent podcasts, on my website at Lost and Found Blogs. I also have social media pages under that name on Facebook, X, and Instagram. I have a Patreon channel where I cover obscure missing persons cases that you may have never heard of, so you should check it out. You can reach me via email at lostandfoundpodcast@yahoo. And remember that cold cases stay cold because their story stops getting told.